today, we're not at war, formally. There's no Canadian war, right? But Canadian forces are on about 24 missions, right? 24 missions that were part of around the world. So you got about 500 Canadian troops leading a NATO mission in Latvia. You got a couple hundred Canadian troops in the Ukraine. You got a force that goes up to 850 in Iraq. That's both in Iraq and Kuwait, in the base in Kuwait. Then you have smaller missions like the mission in the West Bank, right? The Operation Proteus, where you have about a dozen or 15 Canadian troops that are basically there to try to build up or support a Palestinian force to oversee Israel's occupation. I can get into more of that later on if you want. So despite not being at war, Canada still has quite a global military presence. The Canadian government is setting up military bases all around the world, right? They have 3 already. You have the one in Kuwait, the one in Senegal, the one in Jamaica. They've been negotiating for one in Singapore, Tanzania, Germany, and South Korea. And this is explicitly as part of a Pentagon-led initiative, right, to support Washington's military policy, to, as it's put in internal documents, to project combat power under U.S. leadership. You have Canadian naval vessels all across the world's seas, right? Just recently, people may have seen the report about the Canadian vessel with I think HMCS Winnipeg through the Strait of Taiwan with a U.S. destroyer, right? That's happening all around the world, basically all the time. We have Canadian naval vessels in the North Sea, Mediterranean, circumnavigating Africa. So the book, I have a whole section about the history of Canadian gunboat diplomacy, right? Probably the most egregious example of Canadian gunboat diplomacy is in 1921, where the Royal Bank had loaned money to a Costa Rican dictator, Federico Tinoco, just before he left. There were major protests. He, of course, took the money when he left, and the new government said, "We're not paying that back. This is odious debt." You knew the political situation, and so after a couple years of negotiation, Ottawa thought it would be helpful to the Royal Bank to send a couple naval vessels to the coast to say, you better negotiate properly with the Royal Bank. And there's other similar type examples in the history of Canadian gunboat diplomacy. Special forces. I also go through a whole chapter in the book about special forces. And now the special forces, which has really begun since the early 1930s or 1990s, should I say. There's other special forces operations during World War II and other moments, but the the real building up of the special forces since the early 90s is that the appeal for the military and for the political leaders is they're secretive, right? So they don't have to tell us, the population, about when they're getting deployed. So the information we know about Canadian Special Forces is just difficult to completely verify and whatnot. It appears they've been dispatched to about 24 different countries. Right? Some of them have gotten widespread media reporting. Afghanistan, of course, that was discussed. I mentioned Libya. That the UN resolutions in Libya were explicit about no foreign occupying forces on the ground. A number of reports showed that Canadian Special Forces were defying those UN resolution, two different UN resolutions. In February of 2019, the Haiti Information Project videoed 4 Canadian Special Forces at the Toussaint-Louverture Airport in Port-au-Prince. I sent the video to Puglisi, the military reporter, the Ottawa Citizen, and he said that 2 of them, he said 2 of them were probably JTF-2 and 2 were the Canadian Special Forces Operation. Man, I forget the name. JTF-2 is the elite of the Canadian military and of the Special Forces. Why they were in Haiti, we don't know. The Haiti Information Project suggested that it was probably to help the Jovenel Moïse, the very unpopular president, out of the country. There was a general strike going on, and that at that time. But it also in 2004, we know that February 29, 2004, the night where Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the elected president, was taken out of the country by US Marines, put on an airplane, and dumped in the Central African Republic in the middle of the night, that 30 Canadian Special Forces were securing the airport that night. So there's a whole history of Canadian Special Forces operations that I go into in the book in terms of what information that we know of that's on the public record. Another section in the book that I didn't know much about before researching, but there's actually a number of books that delve into this topic, is the whole role of the Canadian military in chemical and biological weapons. Right? It's like quite extensive. It's a whole history of researching, creating chemical and biological weapons. So, for instance, a weapon that it's believed, a shellfish toxin that the CIA tried to kill Fidel Castro with, that was in the early 1970s, that was Canadian researchers and Canadian Nova Scotia shellfish that was used to make that. So working with the Americans at Fort Detrick, or however you pronounce that, in just outside of Washington, on that. Anthrax, mustard gas, and employment, also Canadian employment of during World War I and other periods of different chemical weapons. The Americans, in the late 60s, when anti-Vietnam War protests started becoming significant, and them turning to Suffield base to do the testing, right? Because they were being restricted in the States, then turning to Suffield base to do the testing for their weaponry, right? We know, of course, in New Brunswick, Agent Orange and Americans were testing Agent Orange and other defoliants there to explicitly for how they would be useful in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So there's a whole history of chemical and biological weapon use and all kinds of horrible stories. They were during World War II. They had Canadian military volunteers, quote unquote, to use as guinea pigs, and they tended to be illiterate, right? Poor, like immigrant people who were in the Canadian military, and all kinds of horrible illnesses that individuals ended up with. And it took decades of campaigning to get some compensation to pay these people that had been different chemical and biological weapons had been employed on them to see how they would work. When we talk about the military, we're not just talking about the Department of National Defense. We're also talking about a whole arms industry, right? There's a whole economic element to understanding the power of the military, right? There's major corporations, of course, that are producing a lot of weaponry. So that's that's an important force pushing militarism in our society. As I mentioned with regards to Korea, the military has been used as a way to sort of stabilize capitalism in terms of military Keynesianism has been employed and continues to be employed, but to varying degrees at different periods. The military also has this role in enabling or justifying the channeling of public resources to private corporations for research, right? So if you look back, the military played quite an important role in innovation. Early computers in Canada, that's all the military, right? The military funding that generates that. In the book, The Computer Revolution in Canada, it notes that, quote, "It was the invisible hand of Canadian military enterprise that incited companies such as Ferranti Canada, Computing Devices in Canada, Canadian Aviation Electronics, RCA Victor, and Canadian Marconi to increase their competence in digital electronics." Right? So it was the military that was pushing, that was funding, that was enabling the early corporate innovation with regards to all kinds of different electronic elements. And so we need to be, I think, honest about the fact that has actually been successful, right? It's been successful from a capitalist. The military sort of justifies public spending through the lens of security. That some of these innovations have been useful. A lot of them are designed about destroying, but a lot of the innovations have also been useful. And that, I think, explains part of the power of the military. It's not just that there's these arms companies that are producing weapons, not just big companies that are producing weaponry, but also broader capitalist interest in the military through things like research and innovation stuff. And both, I should mention that both the Liberals and the Conservatives in the most recent election, in their platforms, they both said they were going to set up a Canadian version of DARPA. DARPA is the big American military funding, considered very successful, considered to help fund the internet and whatever, created the internet. It's basically considered a successful a military entity to fund basic research.